New designers are usually both excited and nervous about working with their first paying client. On one hand, it's a major step in building your career. Obviously, you need paying clients to build a career as a surface pattern designer. But on the other hand, if you've never created artwork based on a creative brief for a company before, it can be intimidating. I get so many questions about doing things right, and I wanted to give you a look into some easy things you can keep in mind as you start your pattern design career. The first thing is get your project terms in writing. When working with a client for the first time, you should have a contractual agreement. This should go without saying if you're looking to do licensing deals, but if you're on the freelance side, many companies will have onboarding paperwork for you. For example, if you're in the United States, you'll need to fill out a W-9 tax form. And sometimes we forget that we should have our own protections. By the way, not having those contracts should never get in your way from reaching out to companies. Don't use this as an excuse to halt all your efforts and go down some sort of legal hole for 6 months. If you're doing freelance work, you will want to have your client sign an agreement that covers these factors: pricing and payment terms. So what is, agreeing upon your hourly rate or your project fee and how and when you want to be paid. For example, net 30 days is a typical request. If the payment is late, will you charge a late fee? I, on my contracts, do have a late fee after 30 days, but I rarely use it because most of my clients are pretty good. Even if they're over, I know that they're good for it, let's say. If it's someone who's being egregious, then that is when I might get out that late fee. Ownership of rights. Once you finish the work and the client has paid, are all rights transferred to them, or do you retain some ownership rights in other product categories? Typically, in my experience, freelance work, clients want full ownership of your work. This may be a little bit different in other countries. I do know some designers in the UK who tend to keep their copyright for other product categories, and it's really all what you can negotiate. Design process expectations. If you have a set number of revisions that you offer or sketch options, this is the place to lay out those limits. Is your project fee going to cover unlimited revisions and changes and scope movement, or where are your boundaries on that? Timeline. When is this due? Don't forget to call out that your delivery is dependent on prompt feedback and revision requests, because obviously if a client has a deadline, then they're going to probably be pretty prompt in making sure that you get any feedback that you need to finish the design. But sometimes they don't have a strict deadline and you say, okay, this could take 2 weeks. But obviously if they're not responding, then you can't do your job. So make sure that that is set out in your contract. Also, cancellation policy. If a client gets halfway through the project and backs out for whatever reason, what happens? That needs to be laid out in your contract. And also deposit policy. Do you require a deposit up front? How much? With new clients, I like to request a 50% deposit up front, but it depends on the situation. Some larger companies have their own policies, and sometimes the timelines and deadlines are too much of a quick turnaround that's not always possible. So you have to make a decision on that. I have contracts that I have adapted from a variety of sources. So one common source is the Graphic Artists Guild Pricing and Ethical Guidelines. You have heard of this book if you have had any questions about pricing or contracts or licensing or anything. People have probably suggested, check out the Pricing and Ethical Guidelines book. But it really is a great resource because they do have in the back contracts that have been vetted by, lawyers, and you can just use that copy. You can also do some Googling about what to include in a freelance design contract and do some comparison work, adding in the sections that you need. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm sure if I was, I would advise you to seek legal counsel on this matter. But when you're starting out, if you don't have the money or time for that, for example, if you get an email today asking about starting a project tomorrow, it's okay to crowdsource a bit. If you're entering into more of a long-term licensing agreement, you'll definitely want to be sure your contract is from a reputable source. And if at all possible, definitely contact a lawyer. The next thing to consider is don't be afraid to ask questions. Once a contract is in place and you're ready to get to work, what information do you need to actually design for your fabulous new client? Hopefully your client will provide you with a detailed creative brief, but if that brief doesn't already spell out this information, here are some questions you should be sure to ask to make sure you get a clear view of what this project is about. First of all, is there a color limit? Depending on printing method, this can determine color count. If they are printing rotary printing on fabric, then that is definitely a limited number of colors. If they're digital printing, it's not usually limited. If it is spot color on paper, then that would be limited. If it's CMYK, that's usually not limited. So you don't have to know all these printing terms. The simplest way to ask this is, if you don't have any background with these printing methods and manufacturing, is there a color limit with this art? You'll get to know those printing terms as you develop. The next is there a specific palette or color system I need to use? For example, a certain type of Pantone chip or a palette that they are using for trend purposes. So, stick within this jewel tone palette, for example. What is the art size or the repeat size that you need for the final art? That's obviously a big, important question. What scale should the motifs be? So I put this in there because it's a little bit different than final art size. Sometimes my apparel clients will give me a design and they'll show me a sweet little floral. And then they show it to me on a fashion body, like the print in this image, the scale that they are imagining on a body. So I can see, whether they want 10 flowers to fit on a shirt or if they want like 100 flowers to fit on a shirt. Obviously, the scaling of the print is going to be much different in those two cases. Finally, what's the file type you need for your final art? Is it going to be a Photoshop file, an Illustrator file, a PDF, etc., etc.? And do you have a template that this needs to fit on, right? Is it just the art, or does it need to fit into a file that already has a certain shape in it or has color chips or something like that? Those are questions that you should ask. Optimize for design type. If you're into surface pattern design, you have probably been sharpening your repeat pattern skills. But a big part of surface pattern design is products that have engineered illustrations on them. I know you're probably saying, isn't that really surface design but not surface pattern design? Well, yes, if you want to call the dictionary, sure. But when I talk about surface pattern, I'm really talking about designs for the surfaces of products, from repeating patterns to spot illustrations. And I do a lot of work where the two blend together. Sometimes you might be designing a pattern tablecloth and then you have to design a coordinating table runner that has an engineered applique on it. Or you might use an all-over print on the cover of a notebook. If the project is going to be printed individually, be sure to design individually. Don't be lazy, people. Let me show you two examples I come across frequently and how to make some easy fixes. All right, so here's the first example. This is a design that I did, and I did it as a square. And sometimes you come across a thing where you're using one design and you're changing the dimensions of it. And so I'm going to pretend that my client has asked me to make this into a notebook or wall art or something that's going to be more of a portrait format. So I'm adding this new mask here to show you. And this dimension is what we're going to use for the new artboard. And you might say, okay, well, the wording fits in and, the elements are, spaced in as they were and we're good. And I just change the artboard size and send it off. But if we take the time and look a little closer, we can see that that isn't really ideal. So I always say when we're changing artboard sizes or changing dimensions to look at the edges. So in my original design, I have some things coming in from the edges and they look okay, they look even. But when I do this, suddenly my edge has little bits and pieces like this. If I was going to be changing the size of this design, I would be deleting these, or I would be moving them farther in. So I'm gonna move this up a little bit to be a little more even, and I'm gonna get rid of that. Over here, I'm gonna delete this and delete this, and I'm gonna move this over a little bit. This is going off the edge, but you know what? This is a little confusing. I'm really just gonna erase this, okay? I would clean that up if I had the time. These ones are okay. These ones are probably okay. I would say most of this is good. And now it feels like this is a little empty, so maybe I'm gonna adjust this a little bit, push this over so that things are a little more even. Might move this over. This again over here, I'm seeing some little tiny bit, so I think I'm gonna increase the size of this, and maybe even this gets cut off just a touch, just so that things aren't perfectly inside. I'm having that problem over here too, so I would probably adjust this and maybe make it larger. So you see how this is making it a little bit more even and a little bit more specific to this new shape. So always look around your edges when you're cropping things and make sure that things still look good, and those tiny little bits that are now coming in, you don't need those. So go through and take the time to make those pretty. My second example is when you have a repeat that is being put on an engineered product. So this is based on a client file that I received. I didn't create this repeat and I didn't create this notebook. This was a file that I received. But if I had created it, first of all, I think I probably would have changed the repeat a little bit anyways, but let's just say the repeat is what it is and I put it on this notebook, right? And okay, I get it. You want an all over cutesy little thing, but it's so obvious where the repeat is. And this isn't a repeating product. This is a engineered product. So there's no reason to be able to easily see the repeat and the tulip here that you're seeing. So there's two ways that you can make that adjustment. What I would probably do is, this is a swatch, right? So I just want to show you right here. Okay, so this is the swatch. And again, it's not necessarily the greatest repeat anyways, but let's just, go with it. An easy fix is to click here and get your rotate tool going. Double click. And now I'm just going to turn this, because this is a tossed flower for the most part, there's lots of things that are going in all different angles. I'm going to just turn this like 15% and see where that takes me. And do you see how now this one flower that was up and down and so obvious is not up and down and so obvious, right? It's a lot better. This looks a lot more tossed. I would save that and that would be perfect. Honestly, that's the quickest solution in this particular case. Another solution that you could do is just make adjustments on these, the thing that's the most obvious. Make a few little tweaks by taking the swatch and dragging it out, or I would even say I would build it out myself, right? So if I was making this notebook, I would maybe take this and use all the pieces to duplicate it myself, and then I would change the individual elements. So object, ungroup. So this file needs a little bit more to work with, but I would change some of these flowers to be turned a little bit and some of these bigger elements to be turned. So every other one is turned a little bit more, because it doesn't require too much to go through and adjust just a little bit in a couple cases, and you don't need this to be a perfect repeat. That's the whole point. This is an engineered item. So if I turn one or two of these flowers, then that is going to solve the problem. So those are two ways that you can take the extra time and make these engineered products that use repeat patterns more friendly. All right, and the fourth way that you can make sure that you are really being a design professional, even if it's your first surface pattern design client, is to turn in clean final files. When you get that A-OK that your images that you've been sending, you've probably been sending low-res JPEGs or some other form to show off the work you've been doing. You probably haven't been sending in your Adobe Illustrator or Photoshop files because they're not that easy to send via email to be kind of checking in with your clients. When you get the OK that it is time to hand over your working files and that the project is complete, make sure you take 5 minutes and clean up your files. You never know what last minute changes may be made internally or how files might be used for presentations. So here are some quick tips for optimizing your art. First of all, whether you're using Photoshop or Illustrator, name and organize your layers, group your motifs so that they are easy for moving around. In Illustrator, I have some specific tips because I work in Illustrator a lot, and I'm going to show you these, a couple of these tricks in a minute, but clean up your swatches panel is one thing you can do. Create live and outlined font layers, expand your brushes, and include any fonts, linked images, or extra elements. So let me show you what that looks like in practice. We're going to go back to this file here. And I'm going to pretend that the square version is all good and ready to be turned in. Let's clean up the swatch panel first. Okay, these were the colors that I wanted to use. In the end, I didn't use all of them. So I can delete this palette here. Okay, and here's a trick that you can do. So I'm going to show this. I'm going to drag this swatches panel out so you can really see what's happening. I can do select all unused, and that selects everything in the swatches panel that I didn't use, which is basically everything. And then add used colors. There we go. And now my swatches panel, besides black and white, which if I want to, I could really even go in and individually delete, but you can leave black and white in there. And then it has the 3 colors that I used. And that just makes a nice clean file, and then anyone who's working with it can easily make some changes. All right, so that's trick number 1. Trick number 2 is getting your layers right. So as you can see, I just kind of did this as I did it. I would be moving all of these things. You can select a whole layer by tapping on that thing. And now I've got my greenery on one layer and my text on another layer. And so I would say text and art and grounds, but you can name it however if you have things differently. I would probably, because this does look kind of wild and messy, depending on what the final use was, I would probably go ahead and make a clipping mask for this, which is done by this. Oops. There we go. And that's really just for this one. I could have done it for the ground that combines layers. You know, it's kind of up to you how you work, but I would probably do this just to make it look a little bit neater. Okay, so those are some things that you can do with your layers. If I had typed text in, so if all is calm was a font, and okay, got my caps going on here, but let's just go with it. If all is calm was a font, this is wild. What I would do if this was here and this was all put together, I would have a file layer that I called live text. Okay, and then I would copy this. I would lock the live text and I would hide it. And then with the one that isn't hidden, I would expand it. Okay, so we're just imagining that this was my actual design, that it said all is calm in these wild letters, right? So if this was my final file, then I have the expanded thing. So if they don't have the font, or they don't need to install the font just to have it, and then I have the live if they need to go in and say, why would you we've decided that we don't like this look in which you have lowercase and capitals. So let's do it this way, right? So when you send your files, you're going to make sure you include this font, right? And final thing is, if you have any brushes, if you've used any brushes, so I think I already have everything expanded, but imagining that I had made one more snowflake at the last minute and I made it, and it's made with a brush, okay? Now, there's kind of some debate. You could actually ask your client if they prefer to keep the brushes, keep a version of brushes that are live, but what I might do is save this version for yourself with the live brushes, so if they ever come back and say, can you make, can you adjust these snowflakes, then you can kind of do what you need to with your brushes. But for the file I gave to my client, I would select everything in the whole file, and I'd go to Object, Expand, and that will make everything expanded. And then you can even clean up the brushes palette by going select all unused and delete. And if anything besides this dot and this line are left, that means that you didn't expand everything. There's something in there that you need to find and expand. Maybe you had a locked layer or something like that. Okay, so that's a way you can clean up your brushes palette. And those are some of the most important things you can do to kind of clean up your file. So now you have nice brushes palette, nice swatches palette. Obviously, this is all very Adobe Illustrator focused. You've got your live text available. I would change the name of this one to final text or something like that, whatever, expanded text, because this is the one you're going to use. And definitely lock the live text, and you can save that file. Make sure it has a good clean file name, not final, maybe next time final. And those are the best things that you can do to make sure your client work is on point. I hope that helps you for those of you who are going to start to be getting clients soon, or who have already gotten clients and just want to step up your game a little, be a little more professional. Just remember, you want to get things in writing. You don't have to be afraid to ask questions. You want to make sure you're optimizing for what type of design. Don't be lazy. Take that extra step and make sure that your designs are perfectly set up for the type of design that it is, whether it's engineered or pattern, and always turn in clean final files. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate a like. Any other questions, add them in the comments. Follow me at elizabethsilver.com and on Instagram at esilverdesign.